Today we have a Honda Element. It's a 06 with a bad alternator. We're going to replace the alternator. The first step is to take off the serpentine belt. And the tensioner for the serpentine belt is right under the power steering pump. You can see I've set up these two wrenches. The bottom wrench is a 14mm hex. Next, we remove the power steering pump. The power steering pump has two bolts. One is to the rear, and the second one is underneath the pulley. This is the first bolt for the power steering pump right here. The second bolt for the power steering pump is underneath the pump. It's a 12mm bolt. You can get to it with a 12mm deep socket. These are the two bolts from the power steering pump. And we have set the power steering pump aside, out of the way. Now we have a clear view of the alternator. And we have two more things to get out of the way. One is this emissions hose right here. That to get it out of the way, we're going to have to take off this plastic cover. The other thing that's in the way is this reservoir that's up against the radiator and the radiator fan assembly, and it's just held by one 10mm bolt. With the mounting bolt removed, the reservoir comes right out, and the bottom has a thing that fits down in a slot in the bottom. This hose has a little clip that we loosen up using a little baby needle nose plier. All it takes is a little twisting motion and the hose comes off. Here you can see the clip a little more clearly that we've pulled back, and we just pull this back and set it aside up here. Now the alternator is almost out. For this main alternator wire, it's really not possible to get a socket or a wrench on it until we've moved the alternator a little bit. So we're going to do that first. This green connector comes right off with a little bit of wiggling. Just need to press the tab. On the right side of the connector and wiggle it, and it comes right off. This is to show you the position of the bottom bolt on the left. We've reached it with 12mm deep sockets. It's a little bit fiddly to get the socket onto the bolts. And there is the position of the second bolt. For this one, I'm coming in from the side with a shallow 12mm socket. And it's just barely possible to get the socket on the bolt and turn it. These are the two bottom bolts, and all that's remaining is this top bolt and the main wire bolt, or nut. There's the third bolt, almost out, and the alternator is free to move. This bolt is a lot longer than the two others. Now we have enough clearance to get to the main wire nut with a little 10mm socket, and of course we've disconnected the battery before doing any of this. To remove the alternator, you turn the pulley to face straight up. Okay, you rotate the entire alternator so the pulley faces straight up, and then there's enough room for the alternator to come out. With this shiny new alternator, first thing we do before we put the alternator in place is to put the main wire on with its nut and get it good and snug. Next we get the top bolt mounted, before we tighten down the top bolt, we fish the 2 bottom bolts in. Once we get all 3 bolts started, we can start to tighten them up, and it doesn't really matter what order we do it in. Okay, just starting with the top one. All 3 bolts are already started in their threads. The alternator is in, the connector and the main wire socket nut are tight. The bolts are all 3 bolts, the top and 2 bottom bolts are tight. So now we can put the power steering pump back where it belongs. So for the power steering pump, we get the top bolt started. We don't get it too tight. Then after this one is threaded in, we fish the bottom bolt in. With both bolts started, we tighten them both down. Okay, right there. And when they're both tight, then we slip the belt back on using the same way to create slack in the tensioner. The emissions hose is back on right above the alternator, and we've oriented this clamp in a way that's a little bit easier to get to in the future. Next we get the water tank, water reservoir in. We make sure that its bottom tab is engaged in the slit near the bottom of the radiator. Now we have the belt back on, secured and centered over all of the pulleys. So we're good to go.